A routine school trip to the city zoo was supposed to be a day of wonder, laughter, and childhood memories. Dozens of excited kindergarteners, their tiny hands clutching juice boxes and stuffed animals, skipped along the winding paths, their voices blending into a chorus of cheerful chatter. Teachers snapped photos, parents waved from a distance, and for a brief moment it seemed like nothing could shatter the joy of the day. But then, in the blink of an eye, paradise turned into a nightmare. A moment of carelessness, a locked gate left slightly ajar, a predator watching from the shadows, its instincts awakening. In an instant, the zoo transformed from a place of learning into a hunting ground, and the innocent laughter that once filled the air was drowned out by screams of terror. What happened next was unlike anything the world had ever seen. A lion, one of the zoo's largest and most powerful beasts, broke free from its enclosure, charging straight into the group of helpless children. Chaos erupted. Desperate teachers and zookeepers scrambled to intervene, but it was too late. The bloodshed that followed would leave a permanent scar on the city, a horror too unspeakable to comprehend. How did a simple field trip turn into one of the deadliest animal attacks in history? What went wrong that fateful day? And most disturbingly, could it have been prevented? The sun rose gently over the quiet city, casting a soft golden glow over the streets as the morning bustle began to unfold. Parents kissed their children goodbye, adjusting tiny backpacks filled with lunch boxes and extra sweaters, their hands ruffling hair before waving them off. It was a special day, one that the children had been eagerly anticipating for weeks. A field trip to the city zoo. For many of them, this would be their first real adventure outside the familiar walls of their kindergarten classroom. Their first glimpse at animals they had only seen in picture books and cartoons. The excitement was infectious, spreading from one child to the next as they chattered animatedly about the animals they most wanted to see. Some dreamed of towering giraffes, their long necks stretching toward the sky. Others couldn't wait to see the elephants, imagining their great flapping ears and the way they sprayed water with their trunks. But none of them could have imagined that this day, meant to be filled with laughter and learning, would soon descend into horror. The buses rolled into the zoo parking lot, their engines humming as teachers and chaperones worked to corral the sea of small children bouncing in their seats. As the doors opened, the excitement spilled out onto the pavement, little feet hurrying down the steps as the children took their first wide-eyed look at the towering entrance gates of the zoo. A large, colorful banner hung above the entrance, welcoming visitors to a world of wonder and discovery. The zookeepers stationed at the front smiled warmly, greeting the children as they passed through, their bright uniforms standing out against the neutral tones of the pathways. The air was filled with the scent of popcorn and damp earth, the distant calls of exotic birds ringing through the trees. The kindergartners moved in a chaotic but somewhat organized fashion, their teachers leading them toward the exhibits with carefully planned stops along the way. The first enclosures brought squeals of delight. The flamingos stood gracefully on one leg in their shallow pond, their pink feathers vibrant in the sunlight. The children pressed their faces against the glass of the reptile house, gasping as a massive python slithered slowly across the artificial jungle floor. At the monkey exhibit, laughter erupted as a mischievous chimpanzee tossed a piece of fruit at the window, making faces at its young audience. Parents who had volunteered as chaperones followed closely, their cameras capturing snapshots of joy, the wonder in their children's eyes, the way they pointed excitedly at every new discovery. It was a day of innocence, a day where the outside world and its dangers felt impossibly far away. Teachers checked their watches, keeping the group on schedule as they guided the children toward their next destination. The lion exhibit was next, a highlight of the tour. The massive enclosure sat at the heart of the zoo, a sprawling landscape designed to mimic the vast savannas of Africa. A thick, reinforced glass barrier separated visitors from the majestic beasts within, allowing for an up-close view of the predators as they lounged beneath the shade of artificial rock formations. A single male lion lay stretched out on a ledge, his golden mane ruffled slightly by the wind. His eyes were half-lidded, his massive paws draped lazily over the edge of the rock as he basked in the warmth of the afternoon sun. The children gathered around the glass, their small hands pressing against its cool surface as they stared in awe at the powerful creature before them. They whispered to one another, marveling at his size, pointing at his enormous paws, his sharp teeth just barely visible between his slightly parted jaws. Some giggled at the way he flicked his tail. Others mimicked his movements, pretending to stretch like the king of the jungle. A zookeeper arrived at the exhibit, preparing for the scheduled feeding demonstration. She carried a bucket of raw meat, her movements practiced and confident as she explained to the gathered crowd how lions hunt in the wild, how they use their powerful muscles to take down prey much larger than themselves. The children listened, enraptured by her words, their eyes shifting between her and the lion, who remained seemingly uninterested, his tail flicking lazily behind him. The teachers checked their itinerary, making sure everything was going according to plan. So far, the trip had been a success. No lost children, no tantrums, no disruptions. Everything was going perfectly, but somewhere, unseen by the guests, a mistake had been made. A gate, meant to remain locked at all times, had been left slightly ajar. A small gap, no wider than a few inches, but enough for something as powerful and cunning as a lion to take notice. At first, there was no movement. The lion remained where he was, eyes half-lidded, body relaxed. But deep within him, instincts were stirring. A predator's mind is wired to notice weaknesses, to exploit vulnerabilities. His ears twitched slightly as he caught a scent on the air. Something new, something close. His head lifted, his golden eyes sharpening, as he turned toward the barely noticeable opening in the secondary enclosure gate. The mistake had gone unnoticed by the zookeepers, who were preoccupied with the feeding schedule, with the crowd, with the other animals needing attention throughout the park. But the lion noticed, and in the stillness of that moment, a shift occurred, subtle but undeniable. The day of innocence was nearing its end. The children continued to marvel at the lion, unaware of the danger that had begun to unfold just out of sight. Their world was still full of wonder, of magic, of the simple joys that came with experiencing something new. They had no reason to be afraid, no reason to suspect that the very thing they admired through the glass would soon shatter the fragile safety of their world. The teachers checked the time again, preparing to move the group along to the next exhibit. Parents snapped a few last photos, capturing the delighted faces of their children against the backdrop of one of nature's most fearsome predators. And then, somewhere in the distance, a rusted metal hinge creaked as the unlocked gate shifted slightly in the wind. The zoo had operated for decades without incident. A well-maintained attraction where families could bring their children to experience the wonders of nature from a safe distance. It was a place designed with precision, with enclosures crafted to mimic the natural habitats of the animals while ensuring an impenetrable boundary between predator and spectator. Safety protocols were extensive, checked and double-checked by keepers and staff on a daily basis. Every exhibit had redundancies, secondary locks, emergency barriers, reinforced viewing areas, to prevent any possibility of an accident. But no system is perfect, and all it takes is one mistake, one moment of negligence, to turn order into chaos. The lion enclosure had been secured that morning as it always was. Zookeepers had walked the perimeter, checking that all gates were locked, ensuring that feeding areas were properly sealed before the visitors arrived. The massive predator inside had been calm, lounging in the warmth of the artificial savanna, its muscles relaxed, its gaze half-lidded. There was no reason to suspect anything would be different that day. It was just another routine morning, but somewhere in the process, in the midst of morning preparations and overlapping responsibilities, a mistake had been made, one that no one noticed. Near the back of the exhibit, away from the viewing area where children pressed their hands against the glass, was a secondary access point used only by staff. It was a maintenance gate, an entry designed for cleaning crews, feeding routines, and occasional medical checkups on the animals. Unlike the towering walls and thick glass that separated the lions from the guests, this gate was built into a reinforced steel fence, designed to be opened only when necessary. Behind it, a narrow corridor led to another security barrier. forming a double-gated system that ensured the animals remained contained at all times. But that morning, in a moment of hurried efficiency, someone had failed to secure the first gate completely. It had been pushed closed, but not locked. The latch, which should have clicked into place with a solid metal snap, had remained just a fraction of an inch shy of engagement. To the untrained eye, it looked sealed. It appeared secure. No one checked twice. No one pulled on the handle to confirm that it was truly locked. At first, the gate barely moved. It remained still for hours, as visitors passed by the exhibit, as zookeepers went about their duties, unaware that danger was already creeping into the day. But the world does not remain still, and neither do its predators. The lion had been resting when it first sensed the change, a slight shift in the air, a new draft where before there had been none. The scent of something beyond its enclosure, a world it had never touched, never seen beyond the glass that separated it from the onlookers who stared in fascination. The animal's instincts, buried beneath the routines of captivity, stirred. It rose slowly, muscles coiling beneath its golden coat, its sharp eyes scanning its territory. And then it saw it, the gate. At first, there was no rush, no frenzy. A predator does not strike without reason. It studies, it waits. The lion approached, its massive paws making no sound on the soft dirt of the enclosure. It nudged the gate gently with its nose, the cold steel pressed against its fur, unyielding. But then, as it applied more pressure, there was movement. A small, almost imperceptible shift. The gate rocked just slightly in place, its weight unsupported by the locked mechanism that should have held it firm. The lion paused, exhaled, then nudged again. This time the movement was clearer. A test. A calculation. The realization that the barrier, the one thing that had kept it confined for its entire life, was weaker than it should have been. Beyond the gate, the staff corridors were empty, the zookeepers busy tending to other parts of the park. No one saw as the lion, patient and deliberate, placed one massive paw against the steel and applied its full weight. The hinges groaned softly in protest, the metal resisting but not denying its push. Again, it pressed, and this time, the gap widened just enough for its head to slip through. What happened next was inevitable. The gate swung open with a low, metallic creak. The lion, cautious but emboldened, stepped into the dim corridor beyond. Its massive shoulders barely brushed against the walls as it moved forward. Its steps slow, calculated. This was unfamiliar territory, but it was no longer confined. The air smelled different here, cooler, untouched by the artificial scents of the enclosure. For the first time, it had crossed into the unknown. Ahead, another barrier loomed, the final gate, the last obstacle between captivity and freedom. This one was sturdier, more reinforced, a true security checkpoint. But the lion had already learned something new. Barriers were not always as strong as they seemed. It moved forward with quiet precision, ears pricked, eyes scanning the passage ahead. It could hear faint noises from beyond, the distant hum of visitors, the indistinct murmur of voices, the laughter of children carried by the wind. The sounds were closer now, no longer muffled by thick glass or towering walls. The lion's tail flicked once, an unconscious movement of anticipation. Outside, unaware of what was unfolding behind the scenes, the kindergartners continued their tour. They moved in groups, teachers guiding them from one exhibit to the next, their small hands reaching toward the glass to point at creatures they had never seen before. The lion exhibit was one of the highlights, and as they approached, their excitement grew. The zookeepers, still oblivious, remained occupied elsewhere. One of them glanced at a clipboard, checking feeding times, thinking about the next task on their list. Had they looked toward the maintenance corridor? Had they noticed the slightest shift in the routine? They might have seen the problem in time, but they didn't. The lion reached the second gate. This one would take more force, more effort, but it was not impossible. Its muscles tensed, its body lowered slightly, preparing for another push. It had learned something new today. It had learned that barriers could be broken. Outside, in the open air, the children were only steps away from the enclosure. The lion was too. The moment the lion emerged from the unseen depths of the zoo's internal corridors, the world shifted. What had been a peaceful, controlled environment designed to educate and entertain suddenly became a battleground between human vulnerability and the raw power of nature's most dangerous predator. The unsuspecting children stood only steps away, their bright eyes still focused on the empty glass enclosure where they believed the lion should have been. Behind them, the teachers and chaperones were preoccupied, guiding their young charges toward the next exhibit. None of them saw the threat materializing from the restricted area. None of them were prepared for what was coming. The lion moved with a terrifying silence, its instincts honed by generations of hunting in the wild. Though it had never set foot outside the confines of artificial rock walls and steel fences, captivity had dulled neither its strength nor its speed, and in the moment it took its first step beyond the enclosures, it was no longer a contained zoo attraction. It was a predator in its element. It had spent its life watching the movement of people from behind thick glass, tracking their steps, noting their rhythms. Now, there was no barrier, no division between it and the fragile beings it had only ever observed from a distance. A breath of wind carried the scent of prey, small, fragile creatures in brightly colored clothes, moving in erratic, uncoordinated motions. They were nothing like the sturdy forms of its usual meals, but that did not matter. Instinct did not discriminate. Instinct saw only movement, hunger, opportunity. The first to see it was a chaperone at the back of the group, a woman who turned her head at the exact moment the lion moved into the open. The sight of the enormous predator standing outside its enclosure, free and poised, froze her in place. There was a brief second in which her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. The sight was impossible, a mistake. Then, everything erupted at once. A scream cut through the air, sharp and jagged. The sound shattered the illusion of safety like glass, sending shockwaves through the crowd. The children turned toward the noise, their tiny faces twisting in confusion, some laughing in nervous excitement, unaware that their world had just changed forever. Teachers, responding to the panic in the woman's voice, swung their heads toward the disturbance, their eyes going wide with horror. The lion moved. It covered the distance in mere seconds, its body a blur of muscle and power. The people nearest to it had no time to react, no time to flee or even comprehend what was happening. The first impact sent a child tumbling to the pavement, the sheer force alone enough to break bones. The predator's massive paws crushed soft flesh beneath them, the weight of its body pressing down without hesitation. There was no roar, no warning, only the sound of claws tearing through fabric, of bones snapping like dry twigs under its crushing strength. Then, the screaming began in earnest. Chaos exploded in all directions. Children ran blindly, their small bodies colliding with each other, with the barriers meant to keep them in an orderly group. Some tripped and fell, their panicked sobs drowned out by the roar that finally tore from the lion's throat, a sound that belonged to a world far removed from this one, a sound of primal dominance and hunger. Teachers, chaperones, and nearby visitors lunged forward in frantic attempts to grab the children, to drag them away. But the attack was unfolding too quickly. The lion lashed out again, its paw striking another small form with deadly precision, sending a body skidding across the pavement. A child shrieked as the predator's teeth clamped down, shaking its fragile victim with the same efficiency it would a gazelle in the wild. The sheer power of its bite crushed instantly, rendering any hope of survival impossible. Security alarms blared through the park, a wailing signal that came too late. The emergency response teams stationed throughout the zoo had never prepared for an event like this. They had drills for escapes, protocols for tranquilizing animals that had wandered too far from their enclosures, but this was not a case of an animal loose in an empty staff area. This was an apex predator, unleashed in the middle of a crowd, and it was already killing. A stampede of terrified parents, teachers, and tourists surged toward the nearest exits, pushing and shoving in blind panic. Some tripped over fallen strollers, over abandoned backpacks, their terror making them incapable of anything but the desperate need to escape. Others froze in place, their minds paralyzed by the horror playing out in front of them. The lion, undeterred by the chaos, continued its rampage. It was no longer hunting for food, it was responding to fear, to movement, to the way its victims scattered like prey animals in a panic. Its instincts drove it forward, into the fleeing crowd, swiping indiscriminately, leaving devastation in its wake. Zookeepers, breathless and frantic, sprinted toward the scene, shouting commands into their radios, demanding immediate containment measures. The tranquilizer team was mobilized, but they were too far away, and tranquilizers would take too long to work. The reality of the situation was clear. This could not be resolved without lethal force. The police had been called, but even their fastest response time would not be fast enough. Within minutes, the ground was littered with bodies, motionless or writhing in pain, blood staining the once pristine walkways of the zoo. A small shoe lay abandoned near the edge of a flower bed, its owner nowhere in sight. A stuffed toy, torn apart, was trampled underfoot as people ran for their lives. The air smelled of copper, of sweat, of primal terror. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the lion paused. It stood in the center of the devastation, its golden coat streaked with crimson, its massive chest rising and falling with deep, slow breaths. Its ears twitched at the distant sounds of sirens, at the approaching figures with raised rifles. It had won, but the battle was not over. The hunters were coming, and this time, the beast would not escape. The moment the lion unleashed its fury upon the helpless crowd, the zoo descended into a chaos so complete that survival became an instinct rather than a choice. The once peaceful pathways, lined with cheerful murals and carefully maintained flower beds, transformed into a landscape of horror. The air, once filled with the excited chatter of children and the occasional call of exotic birds, now carried only screams of terror, the guttural growls of the predator, and the wailing of alarms that came far too late. The teachers and chaperones who had been in charge of keeping the children safe were suddenly no longer guardians but desperate survivors, their minds scrambling to process the horror unfolding before them. They tried to shield the children who remained standing, shoving them toward any possible escape, their arms reaching for tiny hands that slipped from their grasp in the frenzied panic. Some ran, their instincts overriding any rational thought, their bodies moving purely on the desperate need to flee. Others stood frozen, their minds unable to comprehend what their eyes were seeing. Locked in place by fear so consuming, it felt as if their limbs no longer belonged to them. The pathways leading away from the lion exhibit became bottlenecks of chaos. Dozens of panicked adults and children tripped over each other, pushing against the locked strollers and fallen bags that clogged the narrow routes. People collided, some falling, others scrambling to their feet as the predator closed in on its next victim. The zoo's carefully maintained directional signs, meant to guide guests through a leisurely day of exploration, now led them straight into dead ends and locked gates. The exits, so clearly marked, might as well have been 1,000 miles away. A few zoo employees, acting on instinct rather than training, rushed toward the horror, attempting to intervene. But what could a handful of unarmed, unprepared staff members do against a fully grown lion, a creature whose entire existence was built upon raw power and predatory instinct? The answer came swiftly. The lion, already driven to a frenzy by the scent of blood and the panicked shrieks of its prey, barely acknowledged their presence before lunging again. Within moments, another body lay still upon the pavement. Parents, separated from their children in the chaos, screamed their names into the void, their voices hoarse and breaking, their worst nightmares coming to life before their eyes. Some turned back, fighting against the tide of escaping visitors, their hands reaching desperately for children who had slipped from their grasp. Others had no idea where their children were. Had they been pulled to safety, or had they been among the ones left behind? Near the entrance of the zoo, security personnel struggled to regain control of the situation. Their radios buzzed with frantic voices, reports conflicting, orders unclear. The first responders were still minutes away, minutes that stretched into eternity for those still trapped inside. Zoo officials attempted to lock down sections of the park, but the paths were too open, the barriers too weak. The emergency gates, designed to contain incidents within specific areas, had never been tested against something of this scale. They were meant for keeping animals in, not for keeping them out. The tranquilizer team, armed with darts powerful enough to take down a charging rhinoceros, was en route, but even if they arrived in time, it would take minutes for the drugs to take effect, minutes that no one had to spare. The reality was clear. There was no saving this situation without bloodshed. The police had been given authorization for lethal force, but the officers had yet to arrive, still navigating the maze of city streets leading to the zoo. The lion, undeterred by the half-hearted attempts to stop it, continued its rampage. Across the zoo, visitors who had no direct sight of the attack only knew that something had gone terribly wrong. The alarms were wailing, the energy in the air had shifted from excitement to unfiltered panic, and people were running. Running without direction, without thought, simply knowing that they needed to get out. Some screamed about an escaped animal, others about an active shooter, the rumors spreading faster than the actual truth. Those in the farthest corners of the zoo were still trying to comprehend what was happening, their movements hesitant, uncertain. They had heard the emergency sirens before, usually false alarms, minor incidents. But this felt different. In the reptile house, families huddled together, pressing their backs against glass displays that now seemed as fragile as paper. In the food court, employees abandoned their registers, the scent of half-cooked burgers and spilled soda mixing with the distant screams. In the bird sanctuary, flocks of startled macaws screeched, their wings beating against the enclosure netting as they sensed the unease in the air. Every inch of the zoo, from the smallest habitats to the grandest exhibits, had been tainted by fear. The lion, still untamed by any sense of limitation, remained at the center of the carnage. Its golden fur was stained dark with streaks of crimson, its breathing deep, powerful, satisfied. It did not recognize what it had done as an act of brutality. To the predator's mind, it had simply reclaimed the role nature had assigned to it. The barriers between hunter and hunted had vanished. The final moments of unchecked destruction came as security personnel attempted one last, desperate measure. The remaining zoo staff coordinated an effort to corral the beast into an enclosed section of the park, using vehicles, flashing lights, and noise in an attempt to redirect it. But a lion that had already tasted unrestricted freedom does not submit easily. As the police finally arrived, their weapons drawn, the scene before them was something out of a nightmare. The zoo, once a symbol of controlled wonder, had become something else entirely. A bloodied war zone of fallen bodies, shattered innocence, and the harsh realization that the illusion of human dominance over nature had just been violently torn apart. The lion turned its gaze toward the officers, the challenge clear in its eyes. It did not understand their weapons, did not recognize their authority. It only knew that it was not finished yet, and for those who had survived its rampage, there was no more time to run. The zoo, once a sanctuary of order and safety, had descended into absolute devastation. The remnants of a peaceful morning lay in ruin. Abandoned strollers overturned, spilled food smeared across blood-stained pavement, shoes left behind in the frantic exodus. The air was thick with the acrid scent of sweat, fear, and something more metallic. Something no one had ever expected to encounter in a place meant for joy and wonder. Anyone had ever expected to encounter in a place meant for joy and wonder. The lion, a beast never meant to exist outside the confines of its enclosure, stood at the center of it all. Its golden coat was streaked with red, its powerful muscles still taut with the thrill of the hunt. The predator had not merely escaped, it had reclaimed its place at the top of the food chain. Human beings, the creatures who had once observed it from behind reinforced glass, had become no different from the prey it had long since been denied. The instincts that had been suppressed by captivity had taken control, guiding every movement, every strike, every calculated leap. And now, as sirens howled and emergency personnel flooded the zoo, it remained unchallenged, its dominance still unbroken. The police had finally arrived, but they were too late to prevent the carnage. What had started as a routine school field trip had turned into an unprecedented disaster, and no amount of training could have prepared them for what they found. The officers who entered through the zoo's back entrance moved in careful, measured steps, their weapons raised, their fingers resting just above their triggers. The reports they had received on the way here were chaotic. Some had described a mass panic, others had claimed a wild animal attack, but none of them had anticipated the sheer scale of the destruction. The scene before them was horrifying. The lion stood tall, its breath coming in deep, slow heaves, its body poised, as if it were already anticipating the next movement of its prey. But there was no longer any need to hunt. The people who had been within reach had either fled or fallen, and the streets of the zoo were littered with the aftermath. The officers knew that no tranquilizer would work fast enough. The animal had killed, and it would kill again if given the chance. There were no cages left to hold it, no barriers strong enough to contain the carnage it had already unleashed. The zookeepers who had spent their lives caring for the animal were helpless to stop what was coming next. They had loved the creature, had nurtured it since its youth. But love would not erase what had been done. They pleaded for a different solution, a non-lethal method, but their voices were drowned out by the unshakable reality that this lion was now beyond saving. The police moved into position, spreading out in a loose semicircle to prevent the lion from bolting. Every officer knew that if the animal escaped the zoo entirely, if it reached the city streets beyond, the consequences would be even more catastrophic. Already, civilians had barricaded themselves inside the gift shops, behind ticket booths, anywhere that might provide a semblance of safety. Some had climbed into trees, others had squeezed into staff-only areas, waiting for the nightmare to end. The moment of decision arrived swiftly. The lion turned its gaze toward the nearest officer, its golden eyes narrowing, calculating. It did not recognize the threat of firearms. It did not understand human weapons, but it sensed the tension in the air. It saw the figures in uniform standing firm where others had fled, and something in its nature registered this as a final challenge. Its body coiled, every muscle tightening in preparation for the next charge. The officers had no choice. The moment the lion moved, they fired. The first shot rang out, cutting through the distant sounds of sirens and wailing. The impact staggered the beast but did not stop it. It recoiled for only a second before pressing forward again, the adrenaline of the hunt still overriding its senses. The second shot followed immediately, then the third. Each bullet tore through thick muscle, forcing the predator to slow, to falter. The lion let out a roar, not of pain, but of defiance. It stood its ground, even as its powerful legs began to weaken, even as the weight of its own body became too much to carry. The officers did not stop firing until they saw it begin to collapse, its massive frame swaying unsteadily before finally giving in to the damage it had sustained. The final shot echoed across the zoo, and then silence. The lion's body hit the pavement with a heavy thud, the once mighty predator reduced to nothing more than a lifeless mass of fur and muscle. The dust settled, the chaos still lingering in the air, but the threat was over. The officers lowered their weapons slowly, their hearts still pounding, their eyes locked onto the motionless figure before them. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the first wave of relief washed over the surviving visitors, their cries shifting from raw panic to something more broken, more exhausted. Parents wept as they searched for their children, their arms pulling them close as if holding them tightly enough would erase the horror they had just endured. Teachers clutched the students they had managed to protect, their eyes glazed over with the weight of their failure to save the others. The zookeepers, who had spent years caring for the lion, stood in silent grief. This was not the way it was supposed to end. This creature, which had once been the pride of the zoo, had been reduced to a body in the middle of a massacre. The animal had not been evil. It had simply followed instincts too strong to be ignored. It had done what it had been born to do, and now it was gone. The cleanup would take days. The scars, both physical and psychological, would last far longer. The zoo, once a symbol of childhood joy and education, would never recover from the tragedy that had unfolded within its gates. Investigations would be launched, blame would be assigned, lawsuits would follow. But none of it would undo what had happened. As the media descended upon the scene, as news helicopters hovered overhead, the world began to learn of the horrors that had taken place. The headlines would scream about the lion attack, about the field trip that had turned into a bloodbath. Experts would debate security protocols. Politicians would promise reforms. But for those who had been there, for those who had survived, there would never be enough answers. The zoo would eventually reopen, but it would never be the same. The echoes of that day would linger, in the whispers of visitors, in the uneasy glances of parents holding their children's hands a little tighter. The exhibit where the lion had once lived would remain empty, a space too tainted to ever house another predator. And as the sun set over the city, the final traces of the nightmare faded into the past. The lion, the king of beasts, had been vanquished, but the memory of its rampage would never die. The city of Columbus, Ohio had never seen a tragedy like this before. The zoo, a place that had once been a beacon of family entertainment, an institution that had survived for generations, was now forever stained by the blood of those who had perished. The aftermath of the attack rippled through every corner of the community, leaving behind a deep wound that no amount of apologies or explanations could ever fully heal. In the days following the attack, an eerie silence hung over the city. Schools closed in remembrance of the young lives lost, businesses flew their flags at half-mast, and the streets near the zoo, which were normally filled with eager families, were now empty, as if the weight of the tragedy had pressed down upon the very ground. News stations covered the incident relentlessly, broadcasting heart-wrenching images of the scene, of tiny shoes left behind in the panic, of parents sobbing outside hospital doors, of the lion's body covered by a tarp as officials worked to remove it from the site where it had caused so much devastation. The families of the victims were shattered. Their grief was raw, unrelenting, a wound that would never close. Funerals were held in succession, each one marked by overwhelming sorrow. Coffins, far too small for their purpose, were lowered into the ground as parents and loved ones stood in shock, unable to comprehend how a simple field trip, meant to be filled with laughter and learning, had ended in unimaginable horror. Photographs of the victims lined the walls of makeshift memorials, smiling faces of children who should have had years ahead of them, their bright futures stolen in the span of minutes. Candles flickered in the evening breeze, teddy bears and flowers piled up along the gates of the zoo, a haunting reminder of lives lost too soon. The survivors, though spared from death, were not spared from the trauma. Children who had once loved animals now woke up screaming from nightmares of being hunted. Parents who had planned the trip as a joyful outing were now consumed with guilt, questioning every decision they had made leading up to that moment. Teachers who had promised to protect their students could not escape the weight of those they could not save. Many of those who had witnessed the carnage firsthand could not bring themselves to return to normal life. The images of the lion's rampage were burned into their minds. The sounds of screams, the scent of blood, the helplessness they had felt as they ran for their lives. Psychologists and grief counselors flooded into the community, offering support to those who had suffered through the horror. Crisis hotlines were overwhelmed with calls from parents and teachers struggling to process what had happened. The city's hospitals, already burdened with the wounded, became places of deep sorrow as they cared for the injured. Children with broken limbs from being trampled in the panic, others with deep gashes from the lion's attack, some too traumatized to even speak. The investigation into the incident was immediate and unrelenting. Authorities scoured the zoo's security footage, analyzing every second leading up to the lion's escape, searching for an answer to the question that haunted everyone. How had this happened? How had a supposedly secure facility failed so catastrophically? The answer, when it came, sent shockwaves through the city. A single unlocked gate, one mistake. One moment of human error. The gate that had given the lion its path to freedom had not been properly secured that morning. A zookeeper, now stricken with unbearable guilt, had failed to double-check the latch. It had been an oversight, a careless assumption that everything was as it should be. That single mistake had allowed the predator to roam where it never should have been, had turned a safe outing into a massacre. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. The zoo, once beloved, became the center of outrage. Protesters gathered outside its gates, demanding justice for the victims, calling for resignations, for lawsuits, for the complete shutdown of the facility. Some blamed the zoo staff, others blamed the city for a lack of oversight, while others questioned why such powerful animals were even kept in captivity at all. The debate over the ethics of zoos exploded nationwide, reigniting discussions about whether these institutions were truly safe for both animals and humans. In the midst of the chaos, the director of the zoo, a man who had dedicated his life to conservation and education, held a press conference. His face was lined with exhaustion, his voice heavy with sorrow as he spoke of the tragedy. He took responsibility, as did the entire leadership of the zoo, but words did little to ease the fury of a grieving city. The legal battles began almost immediately. Families of the victims filed lawsuits, seeking accountability for the deaths of their children. The city launched an independent investigation, combing through every policy and security measure in place at the zoo, looking for every failure that had led to that moment. In the days that followed, the zoo remained closed. What had once been a place of joy now stood empty, silent, its pathways littered with the remnants of abandoned belongings from that fateful day. The once vibrant murals of wildlife seemed almost grotesque now, as if mocking the innocence that had been lost. The lion's body was removed under the cover of darkness, its final resting place undisclosed to avoid public outrage. Some called for its remains to be destroyed, refusing to allow any part of it to be preserved as a reminder of the horror it had caused. Others argued that the lion had simply done what it was born to do, that the blame lay not with the animal but with the failures of human hands. As the weeks passed, the city struggled to find its way forward. Parents held their children closer, the scars of the tragedy still fresh. School trips were canceled indefinitely, safety measures were tightened across all public attractions, and an unspoken fear settled over the community. If something like this could happen once, could it happen again? Some called for the zoo to be torn down, for the space to be turned into a memorial for the victims. Others fought to rebuild, to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. The debate raged on, but the pain remained unchanged. Nothing could undo what had happened. No amount of reform, no tightening of security, no removal of animals could bring back those who had been lost. And so, the city mourned. It mourned in the silence of playgrounds that had once been filled with laughter, in the absence of children who would never return home. It mourned in the hollow expressions of the survivors, in the guilt-ridden faces of those who had been in charge. It mourned in the headlines that slowly began to fade from the national news cycle, replaced by other tragedies, other horrors. But for those who had lived it, for those who had seen the beast standing in the midst of the carnage, who had heard the roars that would never leave their nightmares, there would be no moving on. Only the endless question of what could have been done differently and the unbearable reality that it had happened at all.